Hi, Misha here, and yeah, I'm still on vacation, taking care of some things, both professionally and personally, and it's been good. But I wanted to give you a video in the interim on a gun that I think a lot of people find interesting, including myself. The FN Browning High Power, or GP35, or P35, or Pistole 35. I think you get the drift. First, though, I want to say I sincerely and greatly appreciate the response to the 10th anniversary video. I put a lot of work into it, but I certainly wasn't alone. A lot of people put a lot of work into it. Some you saw in the video who did cameos, others behind the camera. But yeah, the feedback was overwhelmingly great, and it made it all worthwhile. It was fun to do, but I'm glad everyone appreciated it. And we'll try to do videos like that in the future from time to time. Probably not frequently because they take a ton of work, but it's worthwhile. In the past, you've seen these two high powers, both from Inglis in Canada. Here's my No.2 Mark 1. This one's a British. Up here in the shoulder stock is a No.1 Mark 1, another Canadian production, ostensibly Chinese. But here's something new. This is a wartime production, 1943 to be exact. Pistole 35. It is FN production, but under Nazi occupation, Nazi duress. And it actually kind of poses an interesting question. Which is more of a legitimate factory high power, and which is the clone or copy? There's actually kind of an argument to be made for both. So in this video, we'll kind of compare and contrast the two competing war designs. But just for some excitement, here are some shooting clips from actually this gun up here. And then we'll come back and get into some kind of quirky, interesting history. High power. And be held open. Huh? High power with extended mag. Did it a lot better than I expected for an extended mag. So this old girl still runs, and what I've discovered with the high power, it's all about the magazines. If you have good mags in them with good springs, they still work quite well. That's why I was a little surprised this extended mag worked. It was given to me by a friend. It's ostensibly a FN product, but of course it's post-war. 20 rounds, I believe, maybe 18. It works. I mean, they're not new pistols for sure, but it's a testament to its designers that it's still quite relevant, and even in some military and police service to this very day. And while neither of these have the stock slot or the adjustable sights, this one, the Canadian No.1 Mark 1, is actually quite representative of how the pistol was originally envisioned and originally produced before World War II. So let's go all the way back, really to 1920s France. Well before, all throughout, and even after World War I, this was France's standard issue sidearm, the Model 1892 revolver, firing an 8mm round, often called the Lebel revolver. It's not. Yeah, they had lots of little 32s, like the Savage, but this was the standard. And in the 1920s, they knew they needed something new. Going back to World War I, or even before, Browning had an idea. Not so much for a new gun, although he had that too, of course, but for this style of double stack pistol magazine. So he worked on the design throughout the 19 teens and into the 1920s, and first filed for patents on this magazine in 1923. If I can get it back in my freaking gun. There we go, maybe. This is why funneled magwells aren't a bad thing. Unfortunately, the patent wasn't actually granted until after his death. He died in 1926 while at the FN factory. The patent was granted in 1927 in the USA. He had to kind of work around the 1911 because Colt owned that, even though Browning designed it. So there were several early designs, and it's worth pointing out the early magazines he prototyped were for 9mm, and they typically held 16 rounds. Now, after Browning's death, his kind of junior partner, WWII, would kind of pick up where he left off and finish the design. And luckily, by 1928, Zive was able to integrate a modified version of the 1911's operating system with the tilting or tipping barrel, kind of linkless design, because the patents were expired. They had aged out. So the pistol was getting more and more advanced. By 1933, he kind of reduced the magazine capacity from 16 rounds to 13, which might not seem logical, but actually it was. It allowed for a slimmer grip, a more comfortable grip, and just a lighter pistol overall. So by 1934, the first pistols were ready to go, prototypes were done, and the pistol was introduced in 1935, initially adopted by the Belgian military as the P.35. But now we get into the French trials. They wanted a new service pistol, but funding was pretty limited in France in the 1920s. Finally, in the mid-30s, they released some requirements, and they were pretty stringent. The new pistol needed to be compact. It needed to be able to kill a man at 50 meters or greater. It needed to hold at least 10 rounds. It needed to weigh 1 kilogram, 2.2 pounds, or less. It needed to be able to be simple to disassemble, reassemble, maintain. It needed to have a manual safety. It needed to have a magazine disconnect safety. And, if I didn't say it already, which I might have, but oh well, it needed to hold at least 10 rounds. So it seemed a natural fit for the GP, the Grand Power here program, for FN to submit this gun. It fit all the needs. It's under 8 inches tip to tip, quite compact for the time. It weighs just at a kilogram. It holds 13 rounds, 13 plus 1. It does have a manual safety. It's of course single action only. It disassembles quite simply, even easier than a 1911. It fit the bill. And from the beginning, it usually had a stock slot and adjustable tangent sights, so easily able to get someone out to 50 meters. Those are just kind of popular features for that day and time. So they submitted it to the trials and lost. And the trials actually took a long time. They weren't officially held or completed until 1937, at which time this pistol won, the French Melee 1935A, produced by Sachem. This is a Charles Petter design, and if it looks like the Swiss P210, it's because they have a common root. This was accepted, it passed the trials, as did this version, the Melee 1935S, although this was kind of second choice. The funny thing is, neither of these guns hold over 10 rounds. In fact, they're 8. They fire a weaker cartridge, 7.65 long. They do have a positive safety, I guess you could call it that, but it's a pretty primitive, crude safety that just kind of physically blocks things. They do have magazine disconnects. They are relatively light thanks to the cartridge. I guess you might kill someone at 50 meters, but that seems optimistic with this gun and this cartridge. Whatever, France did not select the high power. That was their mistake. But Belgium sure did. and many others were interested as well, including China, which is kind of how this gun gets going. FN had a winner on its hands, and it knew it. Right as war was declared, the Nazis got on the march in Europe, September of 1939, FN had built about 35,000 of these guns. Not a bad number, all things considered. Production would continue, but then May 10, the Germans would invade the region, including Belgium, and on May 20th, they would capture the FN Pistole factory, and on May 29, it would be all over in Belgium. They would surrender. So, what would the Nazis do? Boy, that'd be an interesting bracelet, wouldn't it? Yeah. And that gets us to our new gun. But we will definitely revisit this gun for sure. I recently did a video on the FN 1922. I picked this one up off a friend. It is a wartime Nazi occupation production model, hence the wood grips, kind of wartime blued finish. Very cool gun. And this one I just picked up kind of on a trade from a customer. Very decent trade. This is a 1943, so it's technically a third variant. Came with 2 mags, including the marking on the back here. Again, it has a wartime blued finish. Has a flap, leather, pebble green holster. No stock slot, and a fixed rear sight. Yeah. No lanyard rings on these. Germans weren't too fanatical about lanyard rings. Still a single action only design. Kind of a coarse trigger on these. It's functional, but that's about it. Barrel is a little under 4 3/4 inches. External release. Manual safety. Pretty small by today's standards, but it worked. Ring hammer, so hammer bite's not too big of a concern, but it can happen. Browning style. Mag release, not really drop free, but most of that's because of the magazine disconnect safety. Yeah. Neat guns. So, after the Germans occupy the factory and then Belgium surrendered, the FN factory would be idle throughout June. In July of 1940, the Nazis would order DWM to essentially take ownership, or at least control, and start production back up. They would build various things for them, including the pistols you've seen here. In that year, they would turn out about 8,500 high powers. The Germans took a look at it. They liked it. The high-capacity magazine was nice. The fact that it fired 9x19 Parabellum, their standard cartridge, was nice. So yeah, production started off slow, and these early first variation guns were usually built from pre-invasion parts and were marked with the inspector stamp of 613. And they would continue to build from existing pre-war parts, starting to make some small parts in the 1941, still having a high-polished blued finish, usually having synthetic grips, and the inspector mark would change to 103. But by 1942, they'd pretty much used up all their parts, and they were building guns with their own, wartime built parts, and so they would replace the synthetic grips with wartime wood grips. And these are different because they don't have the red sealant on them that pre-war wood would have had, and they have a rougher finish, rougher bluing, and the inspector stamp would switch again to WA140, and they would continue that. Production would slowly but surely ramp up. In 1941, they would build about 63,000 pistols. 1942, 1942, they would ramp that up to over 80,000. In 1943, where this one's from, they would build over 100,000. And then in 1944, they would go back down to about 63,000 because the factory was liberated in September of that year. It was a popular pistol, but it was not really issued en masse. The 22 over here we talked about was used quite a bit by the Luftwaffe. Well, the high power was more specialized. It was used by Germany's paratroopers. It was also used by the Waffen SS and a few other special forces units. It was prized for its capacity, reliability, and even in Germany, the Browning name was well respected. In fact, that's why they kept stamping Browning on the side, even though, legitimacy was kind of meh. Now, Germany had the FN factory, but what they really didn't have were the people. They had the tools, but a lot of the people, designers and production line workers, if they could, got out of Dodge, either before or during the war. So, in some ways, even though this is built at Herstal, it's a bit of a clone, a copy, and certainly the workers building it were not doing it with happy, happy, joy, joy. So that's why these guns can be pretty rough. On the other hand, the English high power kind of has the opposite story going on. Let's talk about it for a minute. Rewinding a bit, in 1939, the Chinese became interested in the high power. Because of the way the situation was, they had a hard time getting more larger caliber, heavier guns, but they could order handguns with shoulder stocks. This is why the hand cannon, the broom handle, became popular in China. Well, they liked the high power. So they ordered 5,000 from FN Herstal before the war, and some were delivered, others were en route, but then the Nazis, and so the order was never completed. Now, like I said, people fled. I don't know why, they fled the Nazis really quick. And just by happenstance, the director of FN Herstal and some of his staff were actually visiting the UK when the Germans invaded. So obviously they're not going back, they're staying in exile. And more employees of FN would join them there, including Saiv in June, July of 1941. He would flee along with other workers, and he would take with him some drawings, but also just his knowledge of the gun he created. So this could be a huge video just talking about it. It's a very interesting story, but essentially China had a contract with John Inglis in Canada to produce Brenns for them. Now, Inglis was not a new company. It dated back to the 19th century, and they had produced elements for World War I. They proposed, the Chinese that is, that English maybe copy the high power. Well, they'd never made a pistol, but they thought they would give it a try. And that's kind of where things rested throughout 1942. Although Britain was considering building their own version at the small arms factory Enfield. Because at that time, Britain's standard guns were these: 38 caliber Webley Mark IV and 38 caliber Enfield No.2. Yeah, revolvers. Now, break top, which is kind of cool, but not particularly useful. In Canada, it was much in the same boat. Well, by 1943, Canada established the MAB, the Mutual Aid Board, and they were going to divert funding for China. And so China placed an order for 180,000 high powers from John Inglis. These were designated the #1 Mark I. Well, how did they create it, and how does it look so similar to the FN? It's kind of a fun story. Now, the Nazis called theirs the Pistole 640B, B for Belgium. And early on, they had stock slots and adjustable sights. Again, they were built from pre-war parts. But when they started making their own frames, they deleted the stock slot. But they would keep the adjustable sights up till about 1942, maybe early 43 on some guns. But Inglis would build these per Chinese specifications, and that's exactly what they wanted. And this all kind of came together. Like I said, Sive was in the UK. The director of FN was there. Not a technical guy, but he was there. And they had some pre-war samples to work with, and the Royal Small Arms Factory was working on reverse engineering, and they would actually have a couple of prototypes ready by the end of summer 1943. On top of what Sive could remember, they also smuggled some incomplete drawings using the underground out of southern France. So regardless, it all kind of came together where they could put one together of high quality. Now, in the beginning, FN wanted royalties. Canada and Inglis said no. But with a little pressure from some in the UK and China, they agreed to pay a royalty in August of 43. They were going to give a quarter per pistol, up to 180,000 built, and then 15 cents after that. And Inglis agreed to not produce more than 250,000 of these. So that was kind of the basic terms. Things came together. FN and Exile would make some money on this, and they're part of the agreement. Sive would go over to Canada to work, bringing with him another important individual in the creation, René Laloux. And so those two would kind of set up a team in Inglis. They would ramp up production. By December of that year, all the elements, including samples and blueprints, were in Inglis's hand. And by January, they were testing their first pistols. And by February 1944, they were ready to start shipping. The number 1 would have a serial number with a CH prefix, and then they would add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as they rolled over batches. Had a phosphate finish. The serial number was actually applied very late, which means originally they'd be in the white. Of course, after refurb and stuff, that'll get blackened. It had a 500-meter tangent rear sight. And if that sounds crazy, there were some broom handles early on that actually in World War I had out to 1,000 meters. It's adjustable. Attaches to the shoulder stock here. Pretty good length to pull for what it is, frankly. Easy to detach with the thing if I can do it. I say easy, then it becomes difficult on camera because that's how cameras work. If you haven't ever done them, there we go. Yeah, of course we have our stock slot per the Chinese order. So we had the original contract for 180,000 for China and 140,000 shoulder stocks. Now, Inglis would make the metal for the shoulder stocks, like the end piece here and the hinge and what have you. But the wood, the body, and the butt would actually be subcontracted out to Small Arms Limited, SAL, located in a town called Long Branch, Canada, that you probably are familiar with through Infields and even FALs. So that was the initial aversion. But after all this work, Canada and England realized that we're using old revolvers. And we end up with this version here. The first Commonwealth agency to really express open interest after receiving some guns in 1944, but even really in 1943, was the British's Special Operations Executive, SOE. Basically their version of the OSS. So spy stuff. Having a gun firing 9mm made sense. The reliability, the capacity made a lot of sense. But they didn't need the shoulder stock. They didn't need the adjustable sights. Let's keep this simple, straightforward, with canvas holsters. Small Arms Limited had already been contracted to make 40,000 canvas holsters, so that was already a thing. And so they started testing the number 2, as it became known, in late 1943. and it was found to be exactly what they wanted. And so orders were placed. Originally, Britain expressed an interest in up to 50,000, and the Canadian military, kind of taking the lead from Britain, came in and said they would be interested as well. And so they started testing prototypes out, and there we have it. So by 1944, not only are these probably going to go to the Chinese, but there's an expectation that Inglis will be shipping them to Canada and the UK, which, hey, they've already tooled up all this effort, all this time. Why not? Sounds like a good idea and a good way to get away from those old revolvers, which were starting to look kind of obsolete. Now, there would be a number 1 Mark I Star, which had a reworked barrel locking system. They would change the shape and type of the lugs a bit. And there would be a number 2 Mark I Star, which would go to a new hammer, new sear, and new extractor, just to improve reliability. And this was all kind of coming about in the 1944. But like I said, the original Chinese guns were ready to go by February, and they would deliver about 4,000 that spring and early summer. But the MAB would actually cancel the Chinese contract in September because there were just all kinds of issues. The guns were getting stuck in transit. Many of them were stuck up in India, not being used. And even the ones that were, they weren't being used much, and they were kind of afraid that communists might win. It was a whole thing. Originally, they had agreed to sell them hardware to help fight the Japanese, but by this point, the Japanese are very much on the ropes, and so the contract is canceled. Now, Inglis had already built nearly 14,500. But remember, Britain was interested in 50,000, so they would get their first 1,000 in March of 1944, and they would still be the number 1 pattern. And of the remaining guns, about 6,000 would go to England. And at this point, the Canadian military was interested, and they would take about 8,500 of this batch. But then we would start cranking out the number 2 here. Having gotten a taste early in the year, and since the Chinese contract was canceled, and with the creation of the number 2 for Britain, at least initially, by the late fall of 1944, the Commonwealth, the Allies, were more and more interested. Britain would order 20,000 number 2s in November of 1944, and they would add about 15,000 more in January. And these were for the SOE. They were also for the SAS, the paratroopers, bringing their total up to pretty respectable numbers, all things considered, getting close to that 50K. As for Canada, they were a little bit later to the game. They had their original 8,500, nearly, number 1 Mark I's. In January, they would order about 30,000 number 2s. And by May of 1945, when the war was over, they would have nearly 60,000 high powers, Inglis high powers. About 50,000 were the number 2, and a little under 9,000 were the number 1 here. And comparing them to our Nazi example, aside from the obvious differences, wood grips and everything, one economy for the Nazi is we have a more or less fixed half-moon globe front sight, whereas on our English examples, we have a dovetailed drift adjustable. Now, this one is a British X-gun with the old Sunkerite worn finish on it, paint finish. Fun fact, originally, FN would offer either blued or paint finish for the high power, actually paint over phosphate. This was initially created for a French Navy contract dating back to well before the war for actually some 1922s. So FN actually pioneered the kind of paint over phosphate finish that we still see on their guns and many others to this very day. I don't know, I kind of find that interesting. But originally they all left with phosphate finish. Of course, guns would get redone, reworked. This would be the official Canadian sidearm for a very long time. In World War II, it was just used by special forces and paratroopers in England, in the UK. However, in 1954, it was adopted as the L9A1. Initially, they would use refurbished FTR'd English examples like this one here. That's why numbers don't match. It's been rebuilt and reworked 100 different times, I'm sure. And then they would start buying newer examples from FN in Belgium in the 1960s, all the way through the 90s. Whereas Canada, since they had quite a large stockpile for their military, would keep on using theirs well into the Afghan and Iraq war period. But most of your Nazi-produced ones, well, they would kind of go their own way. But yeah, going into 1945, by the war's end, both Canada and England had a large number of these, and with the war being over in June, they agreed to deliver more to China. But again, they were still afraid that they would end up in the hands of communists. Now, Inglis would wrap up their production line, essentially building guns from the parts they had, with the last ones coming out in September of 45, and the last ones would be delivered to China in November. In 1945, they would deliver under 40,000 to China, meaning that China ended up with under 44,000 total. And as they'd feared, yeah, a lot of these ended up directly in the hands of the communists who were fighting the nationalists in their civil war that lasted until 1949. So, yeah, worry warranted there. But both the Inglis and the Nazi occupation guns, yeah, their production was over with the end of the war, a little after. But very interesting pieces of history. The Germans would build about 315,000. Quite a large number, especially with the simplified version here. The English company would build about 152,000, 60,000 of the number 1 style, and about 92,000 of the number 2 style, which is obviously the more successful. You can tell where they kind of remove the adjustable sight from the slide there. Little flat surface where it would have been. Interestingly, the wartime version doesn't have that flat surface. So definitely a huge piece of history, and something that lasted well after World War II, going in the hands of well over 100 militaries, and FN would continue to evolve the design as well. Just for completeness' sake, here's my other high power. This is an Argentinian-made, license-made copy by FM or FMAP. They also produce the FAL. And this one is based on the later versions. Argentina would purchase some high powers from Belgium in 1960. Then they would first produce the 1965 model, and then later the updated 1973. So basically the Mark III, including the bigger spur hammer, the external extractor, and the recess in the slide for the barrel, and having the paint over phosphate finish I mentioned earlier. It's worth pointing out that these, like the wartimes, have a fixed front sight and no adjustment on the rear. Of course, later Mark IIIs from Belgium would also have ambi safety and all kinds of other modern features. But between 1969 and 1989, these were produced under license with Belgian assistance and supervision. After that time, in 1990, they would go off license and keep making them, but in a simplified version. But that's kind of a story for another day. I just thought I'd bring it out to kind of show how the design continued to evolve. In total, it's estimated that about 1.5 million high powers have been produced, at least officially. Unofficially, you have companies like FUG who kind of ripped the design off, or even Arcus in Bulgaria, and several others besides. It is a huge military pistol, very much relevant, and a very good testament to Sive, and a great last design from Browning. Again, Browning mostly made the magazine, the locking system. Well, it was inspired by his, but Sive really kind of adapted it and modernized it when he didn't have to worry about the patents. But just really good guns. I mean, it's a high power, so why wouldn't it be? And of course, these two, or at least the British L9A1 and the Argentinian high power, would go up against each other in the Falklands. Whereas, well, the Belgian duress-produced Pistole 640B would potentially go up against the English high power, at least in 1944, 1945. So it is interesting for the fact that this gun has faced off against itself in multiple conflicts all around the world. Not many guns can really say that. As to looking at our stocks, this is obviously very much inspired, but not interchangeable with that used from the broom handle Mauser. Has canvas webbing. Doesn't hold a spare mag anywhere. Phosphated metal lock work. It fits well enough. They would build quite a large number of these stocks during the war. They had about 30,000 built, but then after the war, over 100,000 were kind of found left over, at least in partial construction. So they're not super rare today. And of course, there are Chinese copies besides of a Chinese stock. Here's the canvas holster. This is what the No.2 came in. Has a spot for a cleaning rod in it. Has a spot down here for a spare mag. It's kind of just a standard NATO canvas holster, but definitively military and cool for what it is. And here is our Nazi holster. It's kind of got a pebble green texture to it. It's all leather, one belt loop, and a spot for a spare mag. Of course, it has to be thicker, larger, deeper for the 13-shot mag. No place for a cleaning rod on this one. So I thought I'd bring them out to show you. Why not? Well, I wanted to do this video to give you something to look at while I'm on vacation, and I thought, well, everyone likes FN, John Browning, high power, 9mm. It seemed like a good fit, and I wanted to talk about this new Nazi one. I've kind of been on the lookout for one, not aggressively, but hoping one to come my way over the years, and this one does the job quite well. I picked this one up a long time ago. It's an honest, Sunker-rated, reworked gun that probably had to have a long history to tell. This one came out of a good friend's collection a long time ago. Seems to be pretty original, non-marked. And this is just one of the many Argentinian ones in the country, but it's mine and I like it. Military finish, not the blued finish. Again, lanyard rings were kind of optional on these. I figure it's a good shooter grade one to have. I've had some FN Mark IIIs before, but this one seems to fill that niche just fine. So which one do you think is more legitimate? The Nazi-produced one or the John Inglis produced one? One had kind of the right spirit and people behind it. The other one had the right factory and tooling behind it. The Inglis definitely seems to be a higher quality gun for pretty obvious reasons, and certainly saw service and lasted for a very long time. Again, with fresh magazines and maybe a new spring here or there and a new finish, These guns hold up exceedingly well. They're simple, robust, and not at all obsolete even in 2021. So with that said, I'd love to hear about your own high powers in the comments. Let's talk about these really cool guns, and let me know what you think. And again, doing this video out of appreciation for all the support from the anniversary video. It's just kind of a little bonus thank you I wanted to give out to everyone. With that, if you could, please like, share, subscribe, and if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. With that, I'm going to oil my guns back up, put them in the safe, and get on with my day. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Well, maybe in a few days. Next time.